Hello everyone and welcome to the Topical Hour. Spider-Man Miles Morales is a sort of sequel to the 2018 Insomniac game, and because the Across the Spider-Verse movies are coming around sooner rather than later, I thought I'd give this game the appreciation it deserves. First off is the story, and actually, the story is the weaker point of the entire game. It's obviously a lot shorter, which I don't really think about in terms of quality, but it's hard to ignore that things do feel a little stretched out. In terms of characters though, I think they're actually pretty good, mostly. First off, Miles' mother gets a lot more depth, and we really get to see more of how she's been after Jefferson Davis' death, and that goes for Genki too. We don't get the most depth from him, but he also gives off the good old-fashioned best friend vibes that Genki should give off. After barely seeing Genki in Spider-Verse of the 2018 game, it was incredibly refreshing to get a little bit more. And he is with us for the entire game, constantly giving us interesting dialogue and talking through side missions. None of his jokes are very funny, but he is at least engaging. Miles in himself admittedly does feel a little blank, and it is unfortunate that Spider-Verse came out before this game because it steals a ton of thunder. And I do like that Miles is noble for the entire story, never falling into selfish ways, but that also kind of works to his detriment, not really separating him enough from Peter. But his gameplay is very different, which I'll talk about later. As for the Prowler, this one is definitely second to the Spider-Verse Prowler, but only in terms of story, because the boss fight we get with him in this game, even if it is contrived, is still pretty epic. Probably the best boss fight of the two Spider-Man games in this series. But I'll discuss that more in the gameplay section. As a character, I definitely like that Prowler doesn't die, because could you imagine if Miles lost his best friend, his dad, and his uncle in the span of like a couple of months? Prowler's arc about being selfish is also nicely fulfilled with him deciding to go to prison for a portion of time to take down Simon Krieger and Roxxon. And I think that brings us to the rest of the villains. We have four main villains in this game, the central one being Tinkerer, but the biggest being Krieger, the other two being Rhino and technically Prowler. Also, this is a quick reminder to like the video and subscribe to the channel, thank you. Tinkerer is problematic for a ton of reasons. First of all, there's not a soul who played this game that didn't immediately know that Finn was the main villain, but then again they didn't use it so much as a twist. Finn is also some kind of science whiz like Miles, and all her tech is more like magic than science. The design is also pretty bland, and the only reason that all the goons and enemies in this game have masks is so they don't have to animate any of the dialogue. It's also weird how they gloss over the fact that Finn supplies the entirety of the underground with these little magic weapons, and she spends the entire game pretending that Miles is somehow against her when really he just wants to make sure no one else dies. And at the end of the story, they had to take some huge leaps to get them to work against each other. So no, I do not like Finn as a main villain. As for Simon Krieger and his people, they're a lot more stereotypically evil, but I can appreciate that they're not trying to hide it. Plus, Roxxon in itself has always been a corporation in Marvel that doesn't shy away from being stereotypical. Simon Krieger himself comes off as a bit of an annoying pest with way too much power and not enough discipline like a man-child. But he also proved himself a bit dangerous when he kills Finn's brother in a pretty cold moment. I mean, he vaporizes this dude. As for Rhino, I never really liked his inclusion. He gets a half-baked red redesign halfway through the game, but we punch off his horn at some point, which, after the last game, we know that all he wants is to be let out of the suit. So Miles, get to it, dude. But also, after his final boss fight, he goads Finn into killing him for some reason. That has never been a character trait he's exhibited, trying to flip people to the dark side, but whatever. And it is worth mentioning that I don't think we even find out if he dies. Finn stabs him, and we never hear from him again, but if he is dead, that was a pretty underwhelming moment. But I think that's enough about the story for now. Let's discuss the gameplay. The gameplay is pretty amazing. First off, the combat is almost the same as 2018, but with key differences. First off, Miles relies a lot more on his powers than he does tech like Peter, which is a very good thing. This is definitely a separate discussion, but superhero media in general has been relying a lot on technology-based powers, but here I like that we go back a little bit to just classic powers. I love web grenades as much as anyone else, but I also like that Miles can fight his own way with more biological abilities. It just feels cool to have these abilities and not have to go through too much garbage as to how they work and how they were made. It's a breath of fresh air. And in some ways, Miles is more powerful than Peter. Peter's obviously physically stronger and has more experience, but Miles has better stealth and his venom abilities for more applications. But speaking of stealth, the stealth in this game is better as well. We have better environments with more dynamic layouts and more enemies, and we also get camouflage that can help us set up better takedowns. It's just more satisfying and fun, not necessarily higher quality. The skill tree also makes a return. There are less skills now, but they're more tuned to Miles' abilities, and we also get recurring skills from the last game, which you get from doing Peter's challenges, which is very smart. The suits in this game in general are admittedly a bit of a downgrade. I mean, the most interesting one is the classic or maybe the programmable matter, but I find myself usually using the original. I wish it had a bit more red, but otherwise it's a great suit. Or at least I prefer it a bit over the redesign in the last game. More on the actual combat though, the game in itself is more difficult than the last one. I actually feel a bit challenged during boss fights, and there are times where I die when I don't pay attention to normal fights. But this also makes the game much more engaging. I want to die once or twice in a boss fight. Don't quote me on that. Not because I can't beat it, but because there's a learning curve. But I will say this, I still want health bars during the boss fights. It's so annoying not knowing how much progress I've made most of the time, and I think the primary reason they don't do this is because fights would feel a lot shorter. But also, I have no basis for what increased damage percentages mean when there are no numbers involved in combat. By the way, and this is a bit of a dig on the last game, but this color palette is so much better than last time. The last game was blue and gray and sometimes an orange that looked like brown. The last color scheme was absolutely awful in my opinion. Now we have the entire visual spectrum in this game. It looks beautiful. Although I do think the Roxxon Red gets a little bit hard on the eyes after a while, but that's a nitpick. However, all of the collectibles in this game are awful. The time capsule locations make little to no sense most of the time, and they're definitely a reskin of the backpacks from the last game, and that brings me to the real issue with this game. It doesn't really do anything different other than what it has to do. Obviously, this stems from it being an expanded DLC, and I think we could have expanded this universe by having more lesser-known rogues. Like, what if Chameleon was in this game? I haven't even seen Chameleon in a Spider-Man story yet, I've only heard of him. Something to differentiate this game from the last other than the animations and abilities. The map is a snowy version of the last map, the villains Fisk and Rhino and Vulture are recycled, and it leads to my question, is this game better than the last one? No, it can't be. This game was a cash grab. Whether or not it's good, it's undeniably a cash grab. It's not optimized that well for PS5, it's got a good color palette and boss fights, but for all the good stuff this game uses from the last, it takes just as much of the problems. No health bars, inconsistent AI, and to top it all off, the story is lackluster. I guess it's kind of a cool thing about Harlem having its own Spider-Man and stuff, and the ending from the Prowler fight forward is actually genuinely really good. And some stuff from the last game is improved. The web swinging is better and smoother, the combat is more interactive, the boss fight design. But every time I talk about this game, I get the same result. I start off positive, and the longer I think, the more negative I get. And that's the same with playing it. I play through the highs and I slog through the lows, which is weird, seeing as this and the last game are both highly decorated and proven to be fantastic. But nothing I'm saying isn't true. The thing that I think decides it for sure though is that everything in the last game was the first time original, whereas this time it's a bit worse and it's the second time around. We should be seeing much more of an improvement, but instead they decided to call this DLC a game. I like playing it for the first few minutes, but every moment after that I like it less and less. And Into the Spider-Verse still outclasses it as a Black Spider-Man story. This game didn't have the time or the budget to improve the stuff it needed to improve, but it was too big to let it sit as a DLC, and it leaves us at this awkward middle ground, where we know this game is trying at everything and succeeding at only a little bit. That takes us right into the number score, which is exactly the same as the last time I reviewed this game. 6.5 out of 10. This game isn't that bad when you play it, but in terms of objective quality, it gets what it gets. I remember I said in a previous review that this game needed to be longer to be better. I take it back, this game needed a full reworking of the story and more time to be its own thing rather than being attached from the hip to the last game. Hopefully Spider-Man 2, which comes out the same year this video was made, will be really good, and will truly capitalize its characters without having to establish them this time around, as these past two games have had to do. And again, I've already said this, but if Miles somehow doesn't end up with the deaf woman,
we're gonna have an issue, Insomniac.
Also, you may not know this, but Topical Hour is on Twitter on a brand new account, so go give that a follow if you want to hear my shorter opinions that don't really fit into the video format. Anyway, that's all for this video, and I'd really appreciate it if you left a like and subscribed, especially if you love Spider-Man as much as I do. Or not, that's fine. Play nice, people.